So very warm welcome. Welcome, Thomas. Looking forward to this session. We are going to talk about how to establish better metrics today and how an increase in outcome focus and measurability in day-to-day work can improve the overall company performance and strategy execution, of course. Let's start with a very short introduction and why we are here today. Thomas, you want to start?
Awesome. Welcome also from my side, and great to have you all here for this webinar today. So really quickly, my name is Thomas. I lead the custom education team here at WorkPath, meaning we look after everything strategy execution that is important to you and to support you along the way. So one part of this puzzle is talking about KPIs and metrics, which we will be doing today. Been with WorkPath for almost 2 years now, and before that spent 8 years with big tech companies, Microsoft and Google, always on stage or behind stage in training enablement, and have always been raised with data and metrics in mind when it comes to decision making.
Yeah, and I'll keep it short. Johannes, one of the co-founders and CEO of WorkPath, always been excited about the architecture of a business. For me, the system of metrics really defines the backbone of any kind of organization. And yeah, I think Thomas mentioned it. What we're going to talk about today is our daily bread and butter. Some of the challenges are big and I think continue to pop up. So also a very relevant topic. And with that, I would say we kick it off. So what have we prepared for today? Just 3 things. A quick intro about the problem. We're going to talk about how we have, seems like sometimes too much data. We talk about the problem of unstructured data, quality of metrics, and the enablement of teams, a lack of enablement of teams to work with metrics in a productive and an effective way. To set the stage, then we have, I would say, the main part, 7 quality criteria that define a good metric, a productive handling and working with metrics. What you can take from that, like we have some tips, some insights, some examples, and then we close the session. We give you some simple ideas how to get started, no matter where you are, no matter how mature your organization is today. And then I think still 5 to 10 minutes at least for discussion, for some interaction, but also in the meantime, of course, let's try to make it interactive if there are questions. And that's why we also going to kick it off with 1 or 2 questions for you. Let's start with that. So you should see a pop-up, and we would like to ask you how you would rate your organization. How data-driven are you in your company today? Somewhat data-driven, a lot. Yeah, I think that pretty much describes how we experience things out there as well. More than 50% somewhat data-driven. Okay, that also gives some idea for today, like maybe where to focus on a bit more. Who's in the room today? So thanks for that. And we have another one for you. That's a little bit more about main challenges working with metrics in your company. And there we try to create a little word cloud. So best case, you just give 1 or 2 words describing the main challenges you're facing, main problems. (24, 28) input for the word cloud. And by the way, that's also something that we're going to put into the slides. So when you get the material, you'll also get that kind of overview. Okay. And then we'll take the last question to also get some engagement into the chat and start the conversation there. Feel free to use that during the webinars as far as possible as well. The last question is the most important metrics and types of metrics that you regularly work with already, and why? Why are those relevant for you? Maybe that also gives us some ideas on the type of roles and functions you work in. One or two most important types of metrics, and why are they important to you? Let's use the chat. Everyone's still typing. Yes, SPICE assessments, customer acquisition costs against lifetime value, a lot of NPS. Leading indicator metrics that basically already gives us a bridge to one of our main topics today. On-time delivery, project duration time. Yeah, makes sense. Okay, we'll again, we keep the chat open. Thanks a lot. Thanks for providing that as a little bit of context. I think that's always helpful to get a sense for the room. And based on that, we're going to kick it off now. So we're going to start with the first topic and describe a couple of the problems we experience every day working with larger organizations out there. So I think one thing that's great, but that's also part of the challenge is just the vast amount of data. It's great in one way because there's a lot of things you can measure today that you weren't able to measure in the past. Digital business models, digital distribution channels. That's a great improvement compared to 20 years ago, obviously. But I think most companies would, when we meet them, would say like it's overwhelming. We just pushing data and we make everything available without any structure. That's not just necessarily helpful. So more available data, larger volumes of data require also more work in structuring these data. And that's clearly something we see, with almost every company that reaches out. So our main point, I think, for this introduction is being data-driven. It doesn't say a lot, right? In general, the idea of being data-driven, make better decisions for the customer, for all stakeholders, based on data, it's great, no question. But something I also said in the post last week, you might be data-driven, but your data might be driving you in the wrong direction, and you might be looking backwards at false data. So just data-driven. A lot of companies today claim it, but that's here, and I'm letting that sink in for a second. I think that's something that's closer to reality than a lot of leaders, a lot of managers would admit today. Another problem that we see is in the types of data. Yeah, and we'll come to that in the main part in just a couple of minutes. You cannot drive forward-looking, cannot steer an organization forward-looking while only looking through a rear-view mirror. What does that mean? A lot of the most common metrics, KPIs, that leadership teams use to communicate strategic priorities, targets, the things you see in the headlines, the things that's communicated with shareholders, it's metrics that measure after the fact. Yeah, you did something, you created value, but there's a long time gap and it's backward looking. You did something successful, something valuable for the customer, and now you're making more revenues, but it doesn't really help you steering. It's controlling success from the past. And that's a huge problem if you don't make a difference here. If we analyze in our customers' accounts, like the types of data that are being used to steer, to communicate priorities, there's still the majority backward-looking KPIs. And again, it's controlling, but it's not steering. And it starts with acknowledging that. I think that's really, really important. And then the last point, why should we care? Yeah, why is this topic bigger than ever? I think also most organizations, established organizations, are still more dominated by ideas from Taylorism, from the industrial age, than we might sometimes experience it consciously, right? So this idea of the organization is a pyramid, and in the top, some people, some smart people make decisions. They have all the data. They give a direction, but everyone below is just executing and is being told what to do. That time is over, obviously. And why? Not just because that's not the best criteria of what makes human work nice and productive, but also it's just too slow. Yeah, we have way more hybrid models today. Obviously, central steering, central decision making provides efficiency. I'm not against that at all, but we have hybrid structures where we have more product, more project-oriented organizations. And if you want to be close enough to the customers, if you want to leverage the new kind of data you have, course correcting fast enough, you need to empower all your teams to operate, of course, within given rules, within given sandboxes, but operate more autonomously, work with data, and make their own decisions. It's the only way to get fast enough and to also be more resilient in the broadness of your organization, right? So I think that's the real reason why we need more data literacy. It's not just a management topic. Usually executives do get all of the things we're going to talk about today, but actually operationalizing that, making that, accessible and productive for all teams, that's what needs to change. And I think that's the big problem where a lot of companies are still struggling today. That's how we look at the problem. But with that, we're already coming from problem and why are we here today to let's talk about how we can do better. Yeah, let's talk about what makes a good metric. Let's talk about some quality criteria that have been proven as productive. And let's see like some important distinctions we need to make between different kind of metrics. All of that, I think, functions as kind of a checklist for you and your team. You can go through that no matter if you are in a board or if you are in an operative team of frontline executors or operators. It is helpful, I think, to structure that approach. And we'll start with a short overview before we jump into the first one. Over to you, Thomas.
Awesome. So let's have a look at the 7 quality criteria that we always see to be true and have a good impact on actually working with metric in a meaningful way. So there's 1 through 7. We'll jump into all of these in detail. And I suggest that we actually kick it off right away with the first one. The team fully owns the metric. What does that actually mean, Johannes?
Yeah, it's a quick one, but it is underestimated. Owning means understanding and really being fully behind that metric as well. Yeah. So teams need to understand, why do we track this metric? How do we calculate it? What does it tell us? And most importantly, how can we influence it? Yeah. It's still a very common theme that most important steering metrics are just being handed down to a team, and it's kind of far away from their day-to-day work. There's gaps between what can I do and how can I influence it. And of course, you will have less ownership, less accountability, less engagement with a certain kind of metric if you sometimes might not even understand how it's being calculated, how it's being brought together, but definitely not something that you and your team came up with, or you and your team actually developed as an answer to a certain kind of business problem or a higher level metric. So some very simple tips, right? By the way, we will show a couple of examples from WorkPath as a platform, but just to visualize how this can be done. Obviously, we don't want to slide into a holistic product demo, but a couple of examples of how it can be done. And obviously, you can also use this in different ways, right? This is not WorkPath specific, a lot of the things. So some tips how to strengthen that. I think it starts with onboarding. In every onboarding journey, in every onboarding plan, you should describe the most important metric for a role, for a team, and the background that I just mentioned, right? How is it calculated? Why is it important? How can we usually as a team influence it? You should establish a process, and we'll come to more of that as well, how teams iterate on their metrics, establish new metrics, and really can own it, not just formally own it, but really fully own it. And last but not least, have clear ownership defined. I think that's also, it's so straightforward, it seems, but still we see a lot of dashboards where it's not clear who is actually the person to go to, which teams are contributing to yours. So clear ownership in a formal way, but even more importantly in a guarantee through a process where people can take real ownership through understanding a metric.
Awesome.
And that brings us to the next one.
Exactly, number 2. And I want to start with a challenge because this is a very common challenge also relating to all of the other numbers that we will see in the course of the webinar that we see with the companies that we work with. So many teams often work in isolation and they don't really have the context of their work. Rest assured that if you go to your employees and if you ask them, hey, what are the most important metrics for our company, they will be able to mention the revenue, the market share maybe. But if you ask them, what does this really mean in the context of your work, in the context of your department or team, it already gets a lot tougher. And you will see that many of these people will not have a good answer to the question. So the idea is really, how can you help them provide this context and connect them to the overarching drivers of your company so that all teams have access and really the full context of this metric. And going to the next slide, one thing that we always see really working well and where we really see companies succeeding in setting that up is this idea of having really thorough and well thought out driver trees. Yeah, meaning that you create a structure throughout the company that looks at the top level, at the levels in between and the lower levels, and really connecting the dots and creating that context of figuring out, hey, let's say I'm in a sales team, how can I actually contribute to this overarching revenue? And what is really a metric that is close to me? Because revenue is still a lagging metric, the rear view mirror that we talked about. And it's something that also impacted by things that other teams do, but what is actually close to my work and that I do and that I can influence. So doing this exercise, as you see on the example here, will then lead you through this driver tree of figuring out, hey, part of revenue is actually how well we do in customer acquisition. And part of that is then also influenced by qualifying leads and sales conversions, which is a lot closer to the daily and operational work of these teams and hence more relatable and can create that connection. And another example would simply also be maybe looking at employee turnover. You can think about what are the metrics that influence that and further drill it down. And in this example, it could be along the lines of maybe having a look at employee satisfaction. And this might then be influenced by the salary that you get on average. And so by building these trees, you can really have a well-informed structure and the context for teams and the space that they operate in. So last but not least, a few tips on how to get there. So first of all, it's really about starting this discussion and providing access to the KPI driver tree of your company, really making that visible and making it a topic of discussion. And then whenever possible, really also allow for people to click in so that they have more context, as in how are we doing here? What's the influence? What's the impact of what we're doing, contributing to that? Who is owning the metric, as we already talked about in point number 1?
Yes, so that's number 2. Really important to understand not just this metric, but other metrics contributing it. Where in this driver tree are we? And that everyone has access to that, what I called in the introduction, sort of like the backbone of the business, right? Really the formula that defines success in any organization. Something that's equally important is to understand the difference between well-established KPIs, well-established metrics that might be quite like stable in the sense of we're always looking at them, and also most organizations look at them, right? Revenue will always be important, obviously, just to give you the most obvious example. But a really important difference to make is there is metrics that are validated, right? We do know if we turn something here, this upper level benefiting metric is moving as well. If we sell more of that, it will create more revenue here. But there's also different kind of metrics. There is metrics that might be just describing a hypothesis. Yeah. So we have a certain problem somewhere and we want to address that problem. Yeah. So you would basically look at, you would basically look at certain driver tree branches, right? You say like, we need to improve revenue, but where's the real problem? Where are we behind plan, right? You figure out along the driver tree on what level do you want to address a certain problem. And then you pick those metrics and you set targets. Yeah. So what we do with WorkPath when we introduce new steering processes, how we work with companies, we establish new goal setting and collaborative planning processes where a team no matter where in the organization, is able to say, like, this KPI needs to change. So I'm going to make this my priority. I'm going to create certain kind of value, certain kind of contribution to fix it or to move this KPI into a better direction. But the main statement here is really some of those metrics you might take are just established KPIs. You already know how this machine works, how this metric might drive the higher metric, but you will also have hypotheses metrics, right? So you might also say, I'm trying to build a new feature here, and I think if we measure that customer behavior, that might have an impact on how much they pay for the product or if they renew a contract. So not all metrics are very sure. And I think it comes back to culture ultimately. It comes back to what kind of approaches a company really fosters and encourages. You need a system, you need a process where teams are allowed to make assumptions and to try out new metrics. In a lot of dashboards, you don't just have an overwhelming majority of established metrics that don't move, though, that move only very slow. But then when you have these more assumptive or not proven, not validated hypothesis-based metrics, they're not really marked as those. And then particularly in management circles, I think you end up having misunderstandings and conflicts. So you need to be really clear on what are we talking about here and what's the difference? Is this a part of the machine? We know how it works, or is this just a hypothesis? And yeah, some tips how you get there. It's using those driver tree and using the analysis of problems along the driver tree branches as part of your planning process, as I said, and encourage really that way of working. That is a lot about role modeling, but also about process design in your prioritization process, I would say. And we'll come to more of that. I think point 3 is really a foundation for some of the next ones that we're going to talk about now as well.
Awesome. So let's have a look at number 4. And this will most likely be a very familiar picture for many of you looking at these currently existing dashboards that do have a lot of information on there, but it's mostly really backwards looking information, looking at the very slow impact of what you have done and really hoping that it influences what you're trying to achieve in a positive way. But the reality is also that many of these measures can actually not be directly influenced because they make up a lot of things that departments, teams have done before that. And we really want to make sure that we get more ahead of us, not look into the rearview mirror, but have a good predictor of driving these most often KPIs, lagging indicators. And this already brings me to this concept of differentiating really consciously between leading and lagging metrics. Lagging metrics that we're very familiar with, that we see in all of these typical dashboards, but really figuring out how can we actually have a better predictor of, in this fictional example here, the accidents that happen at work. Obviously, accidents are something that we want to avoid, there is this very cool saying in German, not sure if it translates into English, but where the child has already fell into the well, Kind in den Brunnen fallen, and this is something that we want to avoid. And so the idea is to think about how can we come up with these predictors, the leading indicators, to actually decrease the amount of accidents at work that we see. And one either hypothesis or something that you've already learned about in the past could then be that we look at the amount of safety helmets that are worn at work. Because the hypothesis is, or the insights that you might already have are, that if we put a helm on everyone's head, this will then actually drastically reduce the amount of head injuries that we have, and in total will contribute positively to reducing the amount of accidents at work. And so a few tips to actually look at this. And Johannes, if you already fast forward to the full slide, the idea is really that when you look at the metrics that you have in your company, there will always be metrics revolving around these 4 categories, if you will, about input metrics, outcome metrics, and the impact, the lagging metrics that you have. And what we see with our customers is that for sure, you will never be able to 100% only look at leading metrics, but there should be a really healthy balance, more on the side of maybe 2/3, 75% of leading metrics that can predict your future success, the impact, where you will still work with the existing dashboards and the KPIs and the lagging indicators that you have. But striving for that healthy balance is something that is often a miss, and that really helps you steer your company a lot better. It does come with this cool challenge of trading the certainty for responsiveness, but we always see that acting fast and being and experimenting and giving also teams the empowerment to do things instead of waiting and hoping that something has an impact will always drive your company ahead. So this basically leads me to the 2 tips that we have here, which is just start with what you already have along the way and what is available. So don't hesitate to just get going and kind of say, oh, we don't have this metric. I'm sure if you think about it, there's always a place where you can start. And then really showing this value of responsive metrics in combination and in contrast with to the lagging metrics, and verify that this makes sense.
Trading certainty for responsiveness, I think, such a good theme for our times in general, but for understandable reasons also challenging for many teams. I think it collides with some organizations' culture, but we need to work on that. I think that's pretty clear. Another challenge, and that's addressed with quality criteria number 5, is teams don't react to developments, cannot react sometimes. And why do we use this picture? It's actually a quote, based on a quote that one of the executives we work with recently used, and it's that's like, I feel like my teams are colorblind to when our metrics turn red, right? I didn't think he meant it in a offensive way to real color blindness, but the context there is it's a lot of metrics, and on the one hand, we talked about it before, if you cannot influence it directly, obviously there will be a certain numbness to red metrics. But on the other hand, also, if you don't really understand, if you haven't established what do certain trends mean, yeah, what does it mean if a metric goes there or there, then you'll have that lack of responsiveness. Yeah, even if teams can influence a metric in theory, you need to establish the underlying ratio. What does a development tell us? And then you need, best case, certain like thresholds, yeah, clear thresholds and clear actions. What are we going to do if the metric moves there? What's the red line, right? What's the upper limit towards which we accept the metric to move? And where do we not accept it anymore? Where do we have to change something? That in combination with a fast-moving planning and prioritization cycle, at least every 3 to 4 months, can be extremely powerful for continuous course corrects, but you need to bring it together. Yeah? You need clear benchmarks and clear health corridors, as we call it. Yeah? And that's something, again, an example of WorkPath. One of our tips in your analytics tool, in your team dashboards, establish clear boundaries, establish clear corridors, and best case already define the consequences. And something you can do is scenario planning, right? If the metric goes there, what will we do next week, next quarter, next year, depending on the flight level of the organization? But scenario planning to define actions and consequences once a metric moves out of a certain health corridor. That's, I think, one of the best tips we can give. And it works very well if you establish that. And no matter where you track and where you manage your metrics, that should be interconnected here. Yeah. So that's one from my side. And the next one is from Thomas again.
All right, number 6. And this is really all around using your resources in an efficient way and using metrics to actually define if you're doing that or not. I certainly am, and many of you, I'm sure, are as well, very familiar with this. We are approaching the end of a quarter or a year. Maybe there is still some budget left that you should use, because the consequence is if you don't use it, it might go away in the next quarter, and no one wants to have less money for what they do. But there's a big issue with that. We just waste that money and time that we're spending on it just to do something, but not really actually understanding what it's driving and what the metric behind it is. So really thinking about efficient use of the budget, the resources that you have, and really making this a point of discussion when you get together. So there are already typical meetings in place, yeah, like your all hands, the town halls, or the team meetings that you have, and we'll see that on the next slide. But it's really also about bringing these metric discussions to these events. And typically it's easier to do that on the higher level events, but it's really also about having a very good penetration and bringing this mindset, especially to the team meetings. So talk about it regularly. Make sure that you have check-ins about your metrics, that you have weekly routines where you discuss those, you add some context, connect the dots, and then also looking again at the owners that should drive these metrics, that they use something like a confidence level where they give you a feedback about, hey, is this on track? Is this off track? Do I need to raise my hand? And do I have an issue here? Do I need support? Do I need an escalation? And this really only comes out of having these regular conversations, which will also enable you to keep track of the trends over time and really keep this top of mind.
So there's clearly no value in a metric if you never talk about it, if you never look at it. And I think that kind of critical thinking, that kind of scrutiny, you really need to apply to metrics on a regular level, on a regular basis. And that's already our last quality criteria for today, at least. In many organizations, you have growing number of metrics, right? You do maybe have an hypothesis-based approach. You establish new testing metrics. You can measure new things, a new digital product, a new digital channel. But what companies oftentimes do not do is filtering them and do a certain kind of quality management. So I think it's really, really essential to continuously evaluate metrics and see, do they have an impact? Do they have a relevance? Yeah, does it help us have more structured, more outcome-oriented discussions? Does it help us make better decisions or react faster? So I think all of you know that kind of continuous development and learning cycle. It has to be applied to metrics as well. Try out new hypotheses, try out new metrics where it makes sense, use them for some time, but after 3, 6, 9 months, you should also review them, not just were they successful, did we meet the target, but also did they have the impact on the higher level metric that we expected? Did it help us steer better? And sometimes the answer just has to be no. That's where you say, okay, then let's get rid of it again. Let's put it at least somewhere into the bag. Not all metrics deserve a place on your weekly or your monthly, your QBR dashboard. Yeah. And talking about this, I also want to make a recommendation or suggest one of the previous content pieces we launched on our podcast. We just launched an episode with Alex Alba, one of the leaders in our customer experience organization, on how to predict success of your strategy and how to optimize strategy execution by looking at the right kind of meta level, process-oriented, behavior-oriented metrics, I would say. So what am I saying here? Your organization probably has sort of like an impact chain like this, right? You have KPIs, a certain kind of strategy. Your organization sets goals in one way or other to drive those KPIs, and your organization does the work. It operates, it executes to make progress on goals and impact KPIs. What you can do is basically analyze the whole process in a central, from a governance perspective, I would say, and monitor what kind of metrics are being used. Yeah? I think this is really helpful, if not in a decentralized, but in a centralized way. You help the organization to establish certain kind of quality criteria and to also, filter through metrics, make sure the kind of metrics the organization uses on all levels have a kind of impact on your main KPIs. So nobody gets lost in a jungle of metrics that are not really helping you with the steering. And that's also something where different tools, again, another example of WorkPath, can help you look into different kind of metrics on a meta level. You're not looking just, was the goal successful? Did we make progress on our most important business KPI? But you also look into the quality of metrics, the impact of metrics. Are certain kind of metrics being used? Which KPIs have new metrics that were connected to them? I think that's really interesting from a governance and from a central strategy execution point of view. That's why it's also part of our tips here. And with that, we're already coming to the grand final, I think. Let's quickly wrap it up. Let's address some of the most common questions, how teams, how organizations can start it, no matter where they are. And then we'll have a bit more time for discussion, for questions if there are any.
Awesome. So you see the quality criteria again on this summarizing slide. And the idea is really that we always see that when we talk to customers and we experience how they work, that the more of these criteria they apply, the more successful they actually are in their strategy execution. So you will for sure not start and have all of these inherently in your nature, in your culture, but pick the ones that you're already good with, build on those, gather some learnings, and then also look at the other quality criteria and continue to incorporate them into your business routines. And with that, we would be very curious to understand and hear from you, looking at the ideas that we presented to you today, how well you now feel equipped after this session, the ideas that we presented to you, that you can successfully work in a data-driven way. So let us know about that quickly in a poll as well, before we then jump to your questions, also the experiences that you want to share and the comments that you have.
4, 5, 6, 7, 12 responses. Nice. All right. And that's, of course, also to some extent good feedback from you for this session today. We will, again, share the recording, share the slides. So these kind of information from the audience will be part of that as well. And I think with that, again, we're coming to the last part, just 2 or 3 more minutes before we open the room for discussions. So what did we do today? We talked about the problems in the context of data-driven ways of working, the problems companies we work with have every day, finding the best metrics to effectively execute, to prioritize and make better decisions. We shared 7 quality criteria that can help you improve on that journey. And then the common question is, okay, some of that seems like a long journey. How can we get started? Yeah, and I think Thomas has a couple of good points. His team experienced that every week. How you can get started without major changes. Yeah, and how you can take it really step by step.
Awesome. Yeah, and you can already keep the slide rolling, Johannes. But the idea is really to build a foundation by having a look at a simple KPI driver tree in the beginning, put all the metrics that you have on a table, organize them in a way that makes sense to you. Yeah, this is an exercise that will require some time. This will also require some involvement from other teams, but it's a really fruitful exercise if you do it correctly. And it's something that's an ever-living construct that you can continue to build on. Oftentimes, it can be tough to look at that and kind of shrug with your shoulders and say, I don't even know where to start. But the idea is really to just start and pragmatically look at what you have. Yeah? Also looking at what you do not have, and then manage expectations that as you learn and go over time, that this will become a more clearer picture. If this was easy, everyone would do it overnight, but this is not the case. So again, stick with it. You will learn along the way. You will have more metrics that come to mind that make sense in your context. So just keep at it. And one thing that's really helpful in terms of doing that is really looking at shorter planning and review cycles. So don't only do this as maybe a yearly or as a 3-yearly exercise. Do look at it regularly and incorporate the learnings as you go into your ideas and constructs. And then next up, facilitating reviews and retrospectives. It's, as I mentioned, all about learning, also getting insights from other teams, bubbling those up. Don't shy away from getting also constructive feedback from the departments and the teams if you're at the higher level, and also don't shy away from actually trying to figure out how you contribute to some of these metrics, because you will figure out that in this process, talking about it and sharing the learnings, this is already a great added value that you can have coming out of it. And last but not least, it's really all about just starting and doing it. So even if there are no metrics in place and you can't think about some in the very first moment, just come up with a hypothesis, test it. That's also why you have these shorter cycles. You can test and iterate as you go, and it will really also contribute to driving your company towards a more learning organization that is also happy with change that's happening more often and faster and really adding value overall.
Well said. And that's it with the official part, right? How can we support you? Of course, we'll provide you with today's checklist for good metrics. So get that list and work with it with your team if you find this helpful. You can also schedule a free consultation session with us, with someone from Thomas' team, with us as a team here, to just describe where you are right now and elaborate on how the next steps could look like and how we could support. And something we invest a lot this year is our own KPI product, and the KPI intelligence behind how it connects with our goal setting products. So you can also schedule a demo, of course, to find out a little bit more what we support here with regards to technology and analytics. If that is too formal, you can also just shoot us an email. Thomas and I are always available. You find our email addresses here and in the deck. So if you want to follow up, if you want to dive a little bit deeper into what we discussed today, do not hesitate to just reach out. LinkedIn and email usually always works best. And yeah, looking at the time, I think we still have time left for discussion, for questions. Yeah, the room is open now. It's up to you.
Awesome. And there's multiple ways. Feel free to reach your hand digitally. You can use the Q&A section at the top as well, or even put it in the chat. So we will make sure that we get to all of your questions.
That's always the thing with these sessions around lunchtime. Any questions, anything you would like to follow up on? I'm going to take this one by Julia. Would you recommend to clearly define KPIs before introducing OKRs in an organization that is not data-driven at all? Do OKRs follow KPIs? How do you think about this, Thomas?
I think it really depends on the level that you're looking at, because typically it's easier on the highest level to think in KPIs for a few reasons. For one, you are typically very remote from the operational work, so you don't have the expert and in-depth understanding of how to specifically tackle some of the challenges that these teams might have. So for you, it's easier to have the aggregate view and looking in the rearview mirror. That is basically the sum of everything that has happened before. And I always like to joke that unless you're Elon Musk sleeping on the factory floor, typically these stakeholders are too remote from that, meaning that I would also encourage you that if you're on the department or the teams level, you should really already start thinking about leading indicators. And it works in both ways. You can do it from the top down and deduce leading indicators from the KPIs, but you can also generate KPIs from the leading indicators. I think I just got it wrong. So deduce from the lagging and then the other way around. I'm sure you got that. So really looking at the context and where you are in the organization is really helpful to start. And then if you're at the very beginning and not data-driven, just keep it simple. Go with what you have. Sometimes it's really about measuring something instead of not having a measurement at all.
Yeah, and maybe to add to this, it's usually this kind of initial driver tree. It's easier to build and more clear than you might be aware. Yeah, I think a first version can be quickly built. Every business reports certain kind of metrics usually, and that's a great starting point. So yes, foundation should be there, but that can be done within just a couple of sessions. And then, as Thomas described, start that feedback loop where you have more and more validated metrics on all levels of the organization clearly. Maybe I also take the next one by Julia. Any thoughts on the amount of metrics you'd use? Curious also what you think, Thomas, but I think it depends a little bit on what level you are and for what kind of routines. Yeah, I would think like with goals, if it's more than 3 to 5, it's very hard to remember and stay top of mind. So if you talk for a team, there should be 3 to 5 like focus metrics that really define their success, their progress. That's like primary metrics, right? Of course, there's also then secondary metric, oftentimes the next level in that driver tree, which might be another 5 to 10, depending on the team and job, maybe 10 to 15 or more. But that's already where you get into like specialized roles and not the whole teams discusses all of those metrics. Yeah, that's why this lesson 7, quality criteria 7, scrutiny, continuously force yourself to limit. You have limited real estate on your dashboard. I think is really essential. Take this cycle by cycle.
All right, and I will jump on the next one from Barnabas. How do you connect the benefits from projects and programs to KPIs, goals, and corporate strategy? This is really key and crucial to being successful with strategy execution, because looking at projects and at the operational level, you should always ask yourselves, what am I contributing to and to what extent? Because if you don't do that, things can happen that we sometimes also see with customers, that you spend a lot of time and resources working on some project, launching it, and then only to find out that no one is actually using it and it does not have an impact. So by looking at these driver trees and also in your mind thinking about, with this project, where would I connect this? What would be the metric that I attach to the driver tree? Where do I have a contribution? This is already a good starting point. And the idea really then comes in a few different steps where we showed this on a slide earlier. You get input, you can do a project, then you have the output, you deliver on that project. But the question is really, what's the outcome? What's the value of that? And how does that value in the long run then also create an impact on your lagging indicators? So in short, connecting all of the dots is very important. And this should also then inform you and give you good feedback on whether some projects actually do not have any value or impact, which should then also lead to the simple decision of scrapping that, which in nowadays world is still oftentimes tough to do because you do not track if you're actually making progress and because people shy away from these difficult but actually important decisions.
Yeah, very valid and common question, right? No goal without a clear KPI behind best case, no project without a clear outcome and goal that this links to or it contributes to. So really good question. I think two more. We have one of Christopher. How would you convince a department leader that he or she should introduce the new leading indicator to get started? And would you as an analyst try to explain the trend that data shows to start with, or would you ask the leader to team to define hypotheses before starting with new leading indicators? How do you think about that, Thomas? I hope you were able to think while I was reading already.
Yeah, no, it's also a very common thing. And the way that we always look at being successful with strategy execution is from two ways. It's from the top down, where you want to have steering mechanisms. So you set up these KPIs and lagging indicators. So you get the teams to think about how they contribute. But you really also want the feedback from the bottom up to understand what are the things that we're doing that actually do have an impact. And I, as a leader, I would be super interested in rather having predictors of success than always sitting at the end of the quarter and scratching my head and looking at the slide and only then understanding if what we did made sense. So it's really all about moving away from the rearview mirror and really looking more towards the front and becoming as a company better at predicting success versus hoping for the best and that everything worked out. So that would be my short answer to that, but there's obviously a few more things that go into it.
Then another one by Johannes Eichholzer. How important is it that the organizational hierarchy, the tree, and the OKR hierarchy tree are congruent?
Yeah, so this is also a very interesting question, and happy to follow up on this one because I think here we have to go a little deeper. But what we typically see is that nowadays organizations are still very much built in this tailorish way, that we are very much driven within our hierarchies and structures and build and think in teams, but not really in value streams. And so ideally, you want to also think about these metrics in a value stream way, because if you think about revenue, for instance, there's many more teams contributing to this one, working together cross-functionally. So looking at this not from a organizational hierarchy structure, but rather from a structure that is rallying behind value streams for customers is one first important step to get there. So that doesn't necessarily need to be a congruency between the two, but it's really about probably rethinking how you create value and then aligning the structure that you build with the value that you create. Hope that makes sense. And again, reach out for if you want to go deeper, because there's a lot more to that as well.
It links back to one of the pictures in the beginning, right? The pyramid and the network. I think most organizations we work with strive for these dual operating models where those two structures can be deconnected and yeah, the value stream or this network of goals, this hierarchy doesn't have to be fixed into functions and boxes and silos, but that is a process as well. Then one or two more. I like this. It just took some time, but we now have more and more questions popping in. Maybe I missed this in the beginning. What is our definition of a metric? You didn't miss it. We didn't bring a formal definition. Thomas, please add or correct, but I think it's any kind of measurable value, any kind of measurable data point that shows progress in a company's priorities or company's most important processes and business goals. So any kind of data point that helps you measuring progress, success, is a metric per definition. If you want to follow up or want to share context, how this helps, of course, also happy to dive into that. Then
Yeah, makes
Jan,
sense. Nothing to add.
another one. How would you use the topics of metrics to convince group strategy to more formally connect OKRs with the strategy process? I think that's actually an easy one. If you own group strategy, it's in your interest that your strategy will be successful, right? And I think formally connecting OKRs with the strategy process means you will know much earlier if the organization is on the right track. You will know much earlier if the organization first understands, adopts, and then moves into the right direction to make the strategy succeed. And I mean, you can prove it, right? We look in companies who've been doing that. You can shorten that time by a factor of at least 3 to 4. Earlier course corrects, much more leading indicators if your strategy will be successful in 1, 2, 3 years from now, and you'll get there. And I think that's the most important point in today's time. You will also get there more efficiently. You will waste less resources on the way to those strategic goals because you can correct earlier, redistribute resources earlier in the context and for the strategy, I would say. Then Nora, how can you convince an organization that is already heavy on KPIs to add an additional measure that need to nearly be measured? It sometimes feels overwhelming.
Yeah. Again, I think there's a lot in there, but it goes back to this idea that I tried to outline earlier in terms of, wouldn't it be great if you could, to a much larger extent, predict the success that you have as a company, which will provide you with a lot of more security for planning, security for investing, and all of the other things that you can think of in this space. So while at first it might look like obviously you have to put some effort into it and come up with something in addition, it's really just complementary and trying to add context. And more context will always allow you to make better informed decisions and ultimately help you steer your company more efficiently. So I would always argue that it's super worthwhile investing that time and really looking at these lagging indicators and trying to figure out how you can predict them more reliably, because this will, as a result, always drive your company forward. So maybe also goes hand in hand with revisiting some of the old lagging indicators and seeing if they're still actually adding value to your discussions or not, because we're very good at collecting things and leaving them on a dashboard for many years because we've always done it like that. So maybe cleaning that up, adding more context while investing a little bit of time and effort to create this more holistic picture. Again, I would always argue is time well invested. And as long as you relate this to metrics that add value and help teams orient themselves, no one will ever reject it. So it needs to be meaningful for the teams. It needs to give them a good orientation or a compass. And then it's just a process that will take some time and some learning as well.
It's clearly a discussion where we regularly support teams in these internal kind of discussions. I would add demystify the key result or leading indicator thing, right? I would say it's not additional measures. It's just, you don't just look into the rearview mirror. That's oftentimes the simple start into the conversation, right? It's not a exotic new kind of metric per se. It's extension of the driver tree, but with better, more effective metrics. Part of that is also, you might be able to get rid of some metrics on some organizational levels, but you really don't just want to steer your organization, look into the rearview mirror. I think that's really the bottom line, right? Then another one by Barnabas. How do you usually complete the KPI tree mapping exercise? Do you have a structure to go through on the metrics and connection? I think the answer is yes, but some more details from Thomas, whose team's doing that every day.
Yeah, the short answer is yes. There are some templates that can help and get there. There are some coaching questions that can help you get there. In the end, it's also about bringing the right people into one room together, because oftentimes this is not happening due to missing alignment. We often encounter companies that do think they have a good overview of how their company works and what the metrics are that should be taken into consideration. But it does require a little bit more support from the teams actually working on these topics to help you get there. So in short, it's working with a well-structured template, some good coaching questions, and really bringing teams from different levels of the organization together. These are already some very good starting steps that can help you get there.
And then you can collect data from the ongoing business, right? What I shared as a tip in quality criteria 7, look at what metrics are being used and what proved to be successful, so you can continuously enrich and improve the data and the metric tree along the way as well. And then one more by Anders. Thank you very much. I see behaviors change as good leading indicators, like increased awareness on security in the working space instead of counting workers wearing helmets. Any thoughts? You brought one example with helmets, so maybe you want to take it, Thomas.
Yeah, so for one, keep in mind, this is just a fictional example to make the point. And for sure, you can go deeper and make this more specific. And I would just recommend that you make it specific to your environment and to your company based on the hypothesis that you have. If you have a better hypothesis that is increasing awareness on security, and very important, you also have a good measurement to actually see if you're making progress with that, then of course, go for it. The example just goes to illustrate that another hypothesis could be you put the helmets on someone's head and then this leads to something. So there's more things that go into it, which then also adds to building and expanding on the driver tree. And at the end of the day, also really checking and coming back to these hypotheses and see which of those made the most sense, which created the most impact. And then maybe it's more about shifting the awareness to the employees and having them be responsible, or maybe it's more about having someone there that puts the helmets on the heads. But there's no right or wrong here. It's really just about the mindset of how you approach it and really figuring out what works in your context and for your company.
Any literature you can recommend for KPI tree mapping, Thomas? I don't have one book top of mind. I'll leave that to you as well. I think some of the books I've read in the past, they are just like very theoretical and a long way or a lot of translation to be done to make it work in just your day-to-day work. So I think rather looking into certain kind of templates and how you can structure such a workshop is where I would look for. But maybe, Thomas, you have something top of mind. Otherwise, also happy to follow up, Nora.
Yeah, so I might have a funny answer, but me driving to work these days is often just a conversation with ChatGPT. So I recommend you use that function as well. Just bouncing off some ideas with the KPI, not the KPI, the AI that obviously also has access to a lot of information is something how I go about it. So it's really about being specific, asking good questions, and then using the power of the internet to get there, but no specific literally in that sense.
All right. It seems like we're not just nearing 1:30 p.m., but also no new questions coming in. Again, would be really excited to follow up and to continue these kind of conversations. So thanks a lot for the engagement. Thanks for the questions. I think that last part was particularly fun. We'll send you the materials and we'll be in touch. So thank you very much for your time and have a great rest of your day, rest of your week. Thank you, everyone.
Take care.